Hello there, and welcome back to Cosmic Slumber. Tonight, we are not going to look up at the stars. Tonight, we are going to step down, through a gate you have never noticed before, hidden between two hedges at the edge of a sleeping town, into a garden that should not exist. A garden where flowers open at midnight instead of dawn. Where the soil smells faintly of childhood afternoons. Where an old man in a soft grey coat has spent his whole life growing something far more delicate than roses. He grows dreams. If you are new here, welcome. If you have wandered back to us again, welcome home. This is a place for slow breathing and heavy eyelids, for soft voices and softer thoughts. There is nothing to solve tonight, nothing to remember, nowhere you need to be. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, you might like to press that quiet little subscribe button, or leave a thought below before you go. It helps other tired minds find their way to this garden too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is settle in. Let your shoulders sink into whatever is holding you. Let your hands go loose and heavy. Let your breath slow, like a tide going out. Let your eyes close if they would like to, and if they are not ready yet, that is all right too. Just listen. Let the garden find you. Let's begin. Once, in a town so small it barely had a name of its own, there lived an old gardener named Basil Thorne. He was neither young nor particularly old in the way people usually mean it. His hair was silver, his hands were soft with age and dirt, and his eyes held the particular calm of someone who has stopped being in a hurry about anything at all. He lived alone, if you did not count the garden. And the garden, as it turned out, was never really alone either. His cottage sat at the very end of Willow Lane, past the last street lamp, past the place where the pavement gave up and became a dirt path instead. Behind the cottage, past a gate so old and green with moss that most people walked right by it without seeing it at all, was the garden. It looked, from the outside, like nothing special. A wall of tangled ivy. A crooked wooden sign, half erased by rain, that simply read growing. But those who found their way inside, and only certain people ever did, discovered something that defied the ordinary rules of soil and sunlight entirely. Because in Basil Thorne's garden, nothing grew from seeds you could buy in a shop. Everything grew from dreams. The silver watering can it began, as most impossible things do, with something small and easily missed. Basil kept, hanging on a hook by his back door, a watering can unlike any other. It was old and dented, the color of moonlight on a lake, and it had been in his family for longer than anyone could properly explain. His grandmother had given it to him when he was young, along with a single instruction that he never forgot. "Water only what people give you freely," she had said, pressing the cool metal handle into his small hands. "A dream that is taken will wither. A dream that is given will bloom." He had not understood her then. He understood her now, after 60 years of watching it prove true, over and over, one quiet evening at a time. Here is how it worked. When someone in the town could not sleep, when a worry sat too heavy on their chest, or a memory would not let them rest, or a hope felt too fragile to carry alone, they sometimes found themselves, without quite meaning to, walking down Willow Lane in the dark, past the last street lamp, past the place where the pavement ended, toward a gate covered in moss that they had somehow never noticed before, even if they had lived on that street their whole lives. And if their need was gentle rather than desperate, if their heart was open rather than clenched shut, the gate would let them through. Inside, Basil would be waiting, usually with a small clay pot and a patient smile, as though he had known they were coming all along. Which, in a way, he always had. The garden told him. It always did. "What would you like to plant tonight?" he would ask. And that question, soft, unhurried, never once demanding, was the beginning of everything. The seed of the Forgotten Lullaby, the first visitor of the season, that year, was a woman named Illy, who arrived at the gate not long after midnight with tears she had not quite decided to cry yet. She was young, not much past 30, and she had a baby at home who would not stop crying, and a lullaby she could almost remember but not quite. Her mother had sung it to her once, long ago, before her mother had gotten sick and then gotten quiet and then, eventually, gotten gone. Illy remembered the shape of the song. She remembered how it felt in her chest. But the words themselves had slipped away somewhere in the years between grief and growing up, and now, standing in her own kitchen at 3 a.m. with a crying child in her arms, she found she needed that lost song more than she had ever needed anything. Basil listened to all of this without interrupting, the way he always did. He did not rush her. He did not offer advice. He simply nodded, slowly, the lantern light catching the silver in his hair, and when she finished, he reached into the deep pocket of his coat and withdrew a small clay pot, already filled with dark, soft soil. "A forgotten lullaby," he said gently, "is not actually forgotten. It is only sleeping. Would you like to plant it here, where it can wake up slowly, in its own time?" Illy did not fully understand what he meant, but something about the offer felt true in a way that facts rarely do, and so she nodded, and Basil guided her hand to press one fingertip gently into the soil, just deep enough to leave a small hollow. "Now," he said, "hum what you remember. Not the words. Just the feeling of it." So she did. A few notes, uncertain and quiet, rising into the night air like the first breath of something not yet born. And where her humming touched the soil, something shimmered, faint and silver, like dew-catching moonlight, and sank down into the earth. Basil watered at once, from the silver can, and told her to come back in a week. She almost didn't believe she would. But something pulled her back down Willow Lane exactly 7 nights later, and there, in the small clay pot, had grown a single flower unlike anything in any garden book. Its petals were pale blue, and they moved gently even when there was no wind, swaying in a rhythm that felt, unmistakably, like a song. When she leaned close and listened, really listened, she heard it. Not loudly, not perfectly, but unmistakably her mother's voice, hidden inside the rustle of petals, singing the lullaby she thought she had lost forever. She took the flower home in its little pot and set it on the windowsill above the crib. And that night, for the first time in weeks, her daughter slept straight through until morning, rocked by a song that bloomed instead of one that was merely remembered. This is the strange and tender truth about Basil's garden. It did not give people new things. It gave them back the things they had already loved, grown gently into something they could hold again. The seed of a child's first steps, not every visitor came with sadness. Some came with a joy so large it needed somewhere safe to go. There was a father, once, named Desmond, whose daughter had taken her very first steps that afternoon. 3 wobbling, triumphant steps across the living room rug before collapsing, giggling, into his arms. He had cried, right there on the carpet, in a way he could not fully explain even to himself. It felt too big to keep only in his memory. He was afraid, in the quiet way that new parents often are, that he would somehow lose the feeling of it, the way one loses the exact sound of a voice or the precise color of a childhood sky. He found the gate the way most people did, without quite trying to. "I don't want this to fade," he told Basil, standing awkwardly by the little stone path, still faintly smelling of the celebration dinner they'd had that evening. "I know it's silly. It's just steps. Every child takes them eventually." "It is never silly to want to keep the good things," Basil said, handing him a pot. "Most gardens only grow what people are afraid of losing to sadness. This garden also grows what people are afraid of losing to time. Plant it. Let it keep growing steps, long after this particular afternoon is gone." Desmond knelt and thought of his daughter's face, that fierce, delighted concentration, the way her tiny hands had reached for him, and pressed the memory gently into the soil the way Basil showed him. What grew, over the following nights, was a small tree, no taller than a child itself, with leaves shaped like tiny footprints that seemed to shuffle and turn on their stems whenever the wind moved through them, as if something invisible and small kept tottering happily among the branches. Basil called it a wobble tree. There was only one in the whole garden, though he suspected, someday, there might be more. Desmond visited it every year on his daughter's birthday, long after she had grown past wobbling and into running, then walking with purpose, then striding out the front door toward a life of her own. And every year, the little tree had grown a little taller, its footprint leaves a little steadier, echoing years he could no longer quite touch but never had to fully let go of either. The moonflower that grew fear into courage deeper in the garden, past the humming lullaby flowers and the soft rustle of the wobble tree, there was a shaded corner where only one kind of bloom grew, pale, luminous flowers that opened only after the moon had fully risen, and closed tight and small the instant any daylight touched them. Basil called them moonflowers, and they were, without question, the most difficult thing in the entire garden to grow. Because moonflowers did not grow from lullabies or joyful memories. They grew from fear. A boy named Theo came to the garden one autumn evening, 11 years old and trying very hard not to look like he had been crying. He did not want to talk about it at first, the way children rarely do when the thing troubling them feels too big for words. But eventually, sitting on the low stone bench by the fountain, he admitted it in a small voice. He was afraid of the dark. Not a little afraid, deeply, wholly afraid, in the way that made him check under his bed 3 times and sleep with 3 lights on and lie awake most nights listening for sounds that weren't there. "Everyone tells me it's silly," he said, staring at his shoes, "that I'm too old to be scared of the dark." Basil was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something Theo would remember for the rest of his life. "Fear is not something we defeat by pretending it isn't there. It is something we grow past, the way a seedling grows past the dark soil it started in. The dark is not your enemy, Theo. It is simply the place where courage has not bloomed yet." He handed Theo a small pot, the soil in it darker than any of the others in the garden, almost black like midnight itself. Plant your fear here. Not to get rid of it. To give it somewhere to grow into something else. Theo did not fully believe this would work, but he pressed his hand into the cool soil anyway, and thought, really thought, honestly, for the first time, about what the dark felt like at 3 a.m, alone in his room. The fear of it. The way his heart raced. The way he felt so terribly small. Where his hand touched the earth, the soil seemed to breathe, once, like something waking up. He came back 3 nights later, and where he had planted his fear, a single pale flower had risen, a moonflower, closed tight as a fist in the daylight Basil had warned him about, but which Basil promised would open the moment true night arrived. He waited. And at exactly the moment the last light left the sky, the flower unfurled, slow and silver, glowing faintly on its own, needing no lamp, no moon, no light at all but the light it had grown within itself. It doesn't chase the dark away, Basil explained softly. It simply proves that something beautiful can live inside it. Take it home. Let it sit by your bed. On the nights the dark feels too big, let it remind you that even fear, given time and care, can become something that glows. Theo took the flower home in careful hands. He did not stop being afraid of the dark all at once. Nothing in life, Basil always said, changes quite that quickly. But slowly, over the following months, with the small silver moonflower glowing softly on his nightstand, the dark began to feel less like a monster and more like a garden of its own, one he was, very gradually, learning to walk through. The recipe that bloomed into memory, sometimes what people brought to the garden had nothing to do with fear or joy at all, but simply with the quiet ache of missing someone. An elderly woman named Margaret came one spring evening, moving slowly along the path with a cane in one hand and something heavier in her heart. Her husband had passed the previous winter, after 46 years of marriage, and what she missed most, more than his voice, more even than his laugh, was the smell of the stew he used to make every Sunday. A recipe he had never written down. A recipe she had never learned, because for 46 years, she simply hadn't needed to. I can still almost smell it, she told Basil, her voice thin as paper. Onions and thyme and something else I can't place. I've tried to recreate it a dozen times. It's never right. I'm so afraid I'll forget what it actually smelled like, and then I'll have lost him twice. Basil, as he always did not try to fix her sadness or explain it away. He simply handed her a pot. Some things are not meant to be grown as flowers, he said. Some things are meant to be grown as scent alone. Close your eyes. Don't think about the recipe. Think about the kitchen. The steam on the window. His voice, humming while he cooked. Let the memory be exactly as imperfect as it really was. She did. And into the soil went not a melody, not a fear, but something far harder to name. A whole Sunday afternoon, 30 years gone, made of warmth and noise and the particular way sunlight had once slanted through their old kitchen window. What grew from that pot was not a flower at all, but a low, soft herb, unlike anything in any garden anywhere, and when Margaret finally worked up the courage to return and gently crush one small leaf between her fingers, she wept, not from sadness this time, but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of it. It smelled exactly like Sunday. Onions and thyme, and something else she still could not quite place, and underneath all of it, faint but unmistakable, the smell of a kitchen that had been full of love for 46 years. She took a small clipping home and grew it on her own windowsill, and on the hardest days, when the house felt too quiet, she would crush a single leaf between her fingers and, just for a moment, be young again, in a warm kitchen, listening to a man she loved hum an off-key tune while Sunday dinner simmered on the stove. The boy who planted a friend. Not every seed in Basil's garden grew from something already lived. Some grew from something a person hoped for but had never quite had at all. There was a boy named Ossian, 7 years old, small for his age and quieter than most children his age tend to be, who came to the garden gate on a rainy Tuesday evening, soaked through and shivering, though he did not seem to mind the cold half as much as he minded being alone. He had just moved to the little town with his parents, 3 streets over from Willow Lane, and in the 6 weeks since, he had not made a single friend. He ate lunch by himself. He played by himself. He had gotten quite good, in fact, at being by himself, in the careful, practiced way that lonely children sometimes do, as though loneliness were a skill worth mastering rather than a wound worth tending. I don't have a memory to plant, he told Basil, when the old man crouched down to his height and asked, gently, what had brought him so far from home in the rain. I don't have anything like the other people you probably help. I just want a friend. Is that something a garden can grow? Basil considered this for a long moment, the rain pattering softly on the wide brim of his hat. A garden can grow almost anything, if it is given honestly, he said at last. But a hoped-for friend is a very particular kind of seed. It cannot grow from wanting alone. It has to grow from something you are willing to give, not just something you wish to receive. Tell me, what would you offer a friend, if one arrived tomorrow? Ossian thought about this harder than he had thought about almost anything in his short life. I'd share my snacks, he said slowly. Even the good ones. And I'd listen if they were sad. And I wouldn't mind if they were different from me. Basil smiled, the particular smile he wore only rarely, and handed him a small pot. Then plant that. Not the wanting. The giving. Let's see what grows. Ossian pressed his small, damp hand into the soil, and thought of snacks shared and sadness listened to and differences welcomed rather than feared, and where his fingers touched the earth, something warm and gold seemed to ripple outward, like sunlight caught briefly beneath the surface. He came back 4 days later, this time without the rain, and found that a small shrub had grown in his pot overnight, round and unassuming, covered in tiny golden berries that seemed to glow faintly even in daylight. What do I do with it? He asked. Eat one berry each morning, Basil told him. Not for magic. For courage. It will not make a friend appear on your doorstep. It will simply remind you, every single day, that you already know how to be one. Ossian did exactly that. And though the berries themselves held no true magic at all, Basil was always careful to be honest about which parts of the garden were truly enchanted and which parts simply helped people remember what they already carried. Something did shift in him. He began saying hello to the boy who sat 2 seats over in class. He began offering half his sandwich at lunch instead of eating alone behind the library. He began, in small and unremarkable ways, to be exactly the kind of friend he had once only wished for. By the time the golden shrub's berries ran out, 3 weeks later, Ossian had 2 friends of his own, and did not need the garden's reminders anymore. He visited once more, just to say thank you, and Basil told him, as he told every child who came through that gate, that the garden had not grown him anything he did not already have inside him. It had only helped him find where he'd planted it. The apology that grew roots in the dark, there are some seeds even Basil approached with caution, and among them, none required more care than the seeds of an apology owed but never given. A man named Halvard came to the garden late one November night, older than most visitors, his coat collar turned up against a wind that had nothing to do with the garden's own gentle weather. He had not slept properly in 11 years, not since the argument with his son, a foolish, stubborn fight about nothing that mattered, the kind that somehow calcifies into something enormous simply because neither person is willing to be the first to bend. His son had moved away not long after. They had not spoken since. I don't even remember what we were fighting about, Halvard admitted, sitting heavily on the stone bench, his breath fogging faintly in the cool night air. Only that I was too proud to call first. And then too much time passed. And now it feels impossible. Too late. Too much has grown up between us. Nothing has ever truly grown too much to clear away, Basil said, settling slowly onto the bench beside him. It only feels that way because you have been trying to clear it alone, in silence, without giving it anywhere honest to go. Let's give it somewhere honest tonight. He handed Halvard a pot filled with soil darker than almost any other in the garden. Soil, Basil explained, reserved only for the heaviest and most stubborn of seeds. Don't think about winning the argument. Don't think about who was right. Just think about your son as a boy, before any of this began. The version of him you loved without any complication at all. Halvard closed his eyes, and for the first time in 11 years, let himself remember, not the fight, not the silence, not the pride that had calcified around his heart like ice on a windowpane, but a small boy laughing on his shoulders at a county fair, sticky-fingered and delighted, calling him Papa in a voice that hadn't yet learned to be angry at anything at all. He pressed his hand into the dark soil, and wept, quietly, the way men of his generation rarely allow themselves to do, and where his tears fell into the earth alongside his memory, something ancient and patient stirred awake. What grew, over the slow weeks that followed, was not a flower at all, but a tree, small at first, gnarled and stubborn-looking, exactly like the man who had planted it, its roots pushing determinedly down through soil that had waited 11 long years for someone brave enough to finally dig. Basil told him the tree would not write the apology for him. No seed in the whole garden could do that. But every time Halvard visited it, sitting beneath its slowly spreading branches, he found the words came a little easier, the pride weighed a little less, until one quiet evening in early winter, he finally sat down at his kitchen table and wrote the letter he had owed his son for 11 long years. He did not know, when he sent it, whether it would be answered. Some gardens, Basil always reminded his visitors gently, can only grow the courage to try. The rest of the story still belongs to the people living it. But 3 weeks later, Halvard returned to the garden one final time, not to plant anything new, but simply to stand beneath the little stubborn tree and tell it, quietly, that his son had written back. The rain that watered worry away Basil's garden had its own weather, separate entirely from the town beyond the gate. And on certain nights when too many visitors arrive carrying too many heavy things at once, the garden would rain. Not an ordinary rain. A slow, silver drizzle that fell only over the garden itself, gathering in the leaves and glowing faintly, like captured starlight given permission to fall. Basil called it worry rain, and it came, he explained, whenever the garden itself decided that its visitors needed something more than a single seed to plant. Something gentler. Something that asked for nothing at all. On those nights, people did not need to bring anything to give. They did not need a memory, or a fear, or a joy too big to hold. They simply needed to walk the winding paths, beneath dripping willow branches and glowing hedgerows, and let the rain fall softly onto their shoulders, their upturned faces, their open hands. A young man named Callum came on one such night, not entirely sure why he had walked so far from home so late, only that something in his chest had felt too tight for days and he hadn't been able to name why. He hadn't lost anyone. Nothing terrible had happened. He simply felt, in the way that sometimes happens to people for no clear reason at all, unbearably heavy. You don't have to plant anything tonight, Basil told him, guiding him gently onto the garden's central path. Some nights, the kindest thing a garden can do is simply let you stand in the rain and be worried without having to explain it to anyone. Not even to yourself. So Callum walked. The silver rain fell on his shoulders, cool and soft and strangely comforting, and somewhere between the fountain and the willow trees, without quite noticing when it happened, the tightness in his chest began, very slowly, to loosen. Not because the rain had answers. Not because it fixed whatever unnamed thing was troubling him. But because, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had allowed himself to simply feel heavy, in a place that did not ask him to explain it, hurry past it, or pretend it wasn't there. He left before dawn, not entirely lighter, but lighter enough. And that, Basil always said, was sometimes the whole point of a garden. Not to fix. Just to hold space, gently, until holding space was enough. The seed of reunion, the most delicate seeds in Basil's garden, the ones he handled with the greatest care, the ones that took the longest to bloom, were seeds of reunion. Because hope, more than almost anything else people brought to the garden gate, was the hardest thing to plant honestly. There was a woman named Priya who came one late summer evening, her younger brother having left for a life across the ocean 15 years before, after a quarrel neither of them had ever quite managed to apologize their way out of. They still spoke, occasionally. Birthday messages. The obligatory holiday call. But the closeness they had once shared as children, building blanket forts, sharing secrets under the covers past bedtime, had thinned into something polite and distant, and she missed it more than she had ever admitted to anyone. "I don't even know what I'd say to him," she confessed. "It's been so long. I don't know if there's anything left to fix." Basil listened, as he always did, without rushing her toward an answer. "A seed of reunion doesn't grow the reunion itself," he explained carefully. "That part is still yours to do, out there, beyond this garden. What it grows is courage. The courage to send the first message. To make the first call. Sometimes that is the only piece that's actually missing." Priya knelt, and thought not of the quarrel, not of the 15 distant years, but of the blanket fort they had built when she was 8 and he was 6, and how safe she had felt, tucked beside him in the dark, giggling at nothing in particular. What grew from that memory was a climbing vine, delicate and green, that wound itself slowly up a small wooden trellis over the following weeks, reaching, always reaching, towards something just out of sight. She visited it often. And one evening, watching it curl a little higher, a little further than it had the week before, she found she finally had the words. She sent the message. A simple one. "I still think about the blanket fort. I miss you." He replied within the hour. The vine, when she visited next, had reached the very top of its trellis and begun to bloom, small white flowers, star-shaped, opening slowly under the moonlight, exactly the way trust does when it is finally given room to grow again. The fountain of unspoken wishes at the very center of the garden, where all the winding paths eventually met, stood an old stone fountain, worn smooth by decades of gentle rain and moonlight. Unlike everything else in the garden, the fountain asked for no memory, no fear, no carefully chosen seed at all. It asked only for a single word, the truest word a visitor could find for the wish they had never dared to say aloud, not even to themselves. Basil rarely guided anyone toward the fountain directly. It seemed to call to people on its own, in its own time, usually toward the very end of a visit, once whatever heavier thing they had come to plant was already settled gently into soil. It was, he always said, the garden's quietest and most honest corner, and honesty of that particular kind could not be rushed toward. It had to be wandered into. A woman named Odalise found her way there one late spring evening, after planting nothing at all that night, simply walking the paths the way Callum once had, letting the hush of the place settle slowly over her shoulders. She had come to the garden with no clear purpose, only a restlessness she could not name, the kind that hums quietly beneath an otherwise steady life and refuses, stubbornly, to explain itself. She found the fountain glowing faintly under the moon, its water so still it looked more like glass than water at all, and without quite deciding to, she leaned over its edge and whispered the first true word that rose up in her. Enough. Not a wish for more. Not a wish for less. Simply the quiet, unspoken hope that someday, somehow, she might feel that the life she already had was enough, without needing to chase anything further to prove it to herself. The water rippled once, gently, at the sound of her voice, and where the ripple reached the fountain's edge, a single small light bloomed beneath the surface, soft gold, no larger than a firefly, drifting slowly downward until it settled among the smooth stones at the bottom, joining dozens of others already resting there. Reds and blues and silvers and greens, each one a different visitor's unspoken word, gathered quietly over years and years, glowing together at the bottom of the fountain like a small constellation kept safe underwater. The fountain doesn't grant the wish, Basil told her, when she finally noticed him standing nearby, tending a nearby hedge with quiet patience. It simply proves that you finally said it. Sometimes that is the hardest part of any wish, not receiving it, but admitting, even just to yourself, that you have won it all. Odalie stood by the fountain for a long while that night, watching her small gold light settle among the others, and though nothing about her life changed overnight, no sudden transformation, no dramatic turn, she found, in the weeks that followed, that the restlessness in her chest had quieted, just slightly. Just enough. As though the simple act of naming it, once, honestly, beneath a patient moon, had been most of what it ever needed from her. Basil visited the fountain every night as part of his rounds, watching the small lights drift and settle, reds beside golds beside silvers beside blues. He never knew all the words behind them. He did not need to. The fountain kept its visitors' truths as gently and privately as a good friend keeps a secret, and Basil had long ago learned that some parts of a garden are meant only to be tended, never fully understood. The gardener's own seed for all the dreams Basil Thorne had helped grow over the decades, the lullabies, the courage, the reunions, the quiet Sunday afternoons brought back to life through scent and memory. There was one small, shaded corner of the garden that no visitor had ever been shown. A corner behind the old stone wall, wrapped in ivy so thick it seemed almost deliberate, as though the garden itself were keeping a secret. It held a single pot, and in it, after 60 years, still nothing had grown at all. Basil had planted it himself, long ago, as a very young man, back when his grandmother had first placed the silver watering can into his hands and told him the garden's quiet rule. He had never told anyone what he had planted that night. Not the visitors who came seeking comfort. Not even the garden itself seemed to fully understand it, and gardens, as a rule, understood almost everything. But if you had asked him, and no one ever had, not directly, he might have told you that he had planted, on that very first night so long ago, the simple hope that someday, somehow, he would not have to tend this garden alone forever. That someone, someday, would walk through the mossy gate not as a visitor carrying sorrow, but as someone who might stay. For 60 years, the pot had remained empty soil. Not dead. Never dead. Just patient, the way the oldest and truest hopes often are. And then, one quiet night this very autumn, the same autumn that had brought Ely and Desmond and Theo and Margaret and Callum and Priya each walking down Willow Lane in their own private hours of need, Basil noticed, kneeling by the wall as he did every evening out of habit more than expectation, the faintest shimmer of green. A single, impossibly small sprout, pushing up through 60 years of patient dark soil. He did not know yet what it would grow into. Perhaps a helper, someday, to walk the paths beside him when his knees grew too tired for the long rounds. Perhaps simply a reminder that even the oldest, quietest hopes are still, after all this time, alive and growing, however slowly. He watered it gently, with the silver can, the way his grandmother had taught him. And for the first time in a very long while, old Basil Thorne allowed himself, alone in his moonlit garden, to smile the particular smile of someone who has just remembered that even gardeners are allowed to hope. The garden at midnight, if you were to walk the paths of Basil's garden on any ordinary midnight, and by now, perhaps, some small part of you already has, in the way that sleepy minds sometimes wander into places stories have shown them, you would find it hushed and glowing and utterly unlike anywhere else in the waking world. The lullaby flowers hum so softly you might mistake it for the wind. The wobble tree's footprint leaves shuffle gently on branches too small to hold a single real footstep, echoing the memory of 1,000 first steps that came before. The moonflowers glow along the shaded wall, patient silver light for anyone who still needs to learn that fear and beauty can live in the very same soil. Margaret's herb bed drifts its faint scent of onions and thyme across the whole garden on quiet nights, a Sunday afternoon that never quite ends. Priya's vine climbs a little higher every season, starflowers opening toward a sky full of second chances. And somewhere beyond the old stone wall, wrapped in patient ivy, one small green sprout reaches up, slowly, toward a hope 60 years in the growing. Basil walks these paths every night before he sleeps, the silver watering can in hand, checking on each small living thing the way any good gardener checks on what they love. He does not rush. He never has. Some things, he has learned across a long lifetime of tending dreams instead of ordinary plants, can only grow at exactly the pace they need, and not one moment faster.